Hey everybody! Today I thought we would take a minute to talk about one of my obsessions as it relates to one of my other obsessions. So you might notice, you might not, my hair's kind of covering it, that I'm wearing my Slytherin robes today. And the reason for that is that I want to talk to you about Harry Potter, and specifically the Tales of Beedle the Bard. I don't know why it's ghost sound, it just is. If you've somehow stumbled upon this vlog without any idea of who I am or what I do, I'm a professional storyteller. I have many other jobs, but that's one of them, and I work specifically with fairy tales as told for adults, so usually alternative versions of fairy tales, definitely not the Disney-fied, cleaned up, sterile nonsense that you get in most pop culture. Now, before I get into the contents of the book itself, before I start talking about the stories themselves and my opinions on those or anything like that, I just wanted to show you my copy. This was a gift for Yule the year it came out. It is a special collector's edition version of Tales of Beedle the Bard. That's the back side. And this is not an actual book. This is beautiful and leather and lovely and beautifully constructed. But when you open it up, that's what you get inside. This pocket over here contains an envelope with some art in it. I'm not going to take that out right now because that's a whole lot of paging through stuff. But then there's this velvet bag on the other side, which has, I believe, J.K. Rowling's signature on it. If it's not J.K. Rowling's signature, then I have no idea what that scrawl is. And then inside the bag itself, there we go, is the book, The Tales of Beedle the Bard. It's completely unmarked on the exterior. It's got all this fancy, whatever you would call all this silver filigreed stuff. It's got a little bit of a clasp that you open up, and then I think the interior is pretty standard. Like, I think this is the same art that you get in the standard version of the book. Obviously the layout's a little different because it's a slightly different size than the standard edition, but I think the content is all the same. So let's talk about that content. So I had not previously read The Tales of Beedle the Bard. It's been sitting on my shelf and I've been too afraid to, like, touch it and open it. And then I decided that was stupid and I should just get over myself and read it. And so of course I read the introduction first by J.K. Rowling, and I was struck by how proud she was of her heroines. She made this comment about how the heroines in her stories, / in Beedle the Bard's stories, were so different from the heroines of real-world Muggle fairy tales. The main difference that she cited was that her heroines were, go-getters and strong, proactive female characters. And that makes me worry that she's never read a fairy tale. Don't get me wrong, there are some lame-ass heroines in fairy tales. Like, putting Disney aside for a second and not even opening up that can of worms, there are some lame-ass heroines who sit back and everything just happens to them or for them, right? Absolutely not denying that. There's also heroines like Molly Whuppie, who, her story starts off very similar to Hansel and Gretel, where she gets ditched in the woods, and instead of being a big baby about it, goes out and kills a fucking ogre and steals a giant shoes and just fucking kicks ass. There's the princess in The Seven Ravens, or The 12 Swans, whichever version of that story you prefer, who performs this huge act of self-sacrifice to save her brothers. So the fact that JK is so proud of how strong and independent her heroines are, like I said, sort of makes me worry that she's never read an actual fairy tale. So I was a little worried about what the fairy tales she wrote would be like if that's her impression of classic, traditional, real-world fairy tales. That being said, the first tale in the book, The Hopping Pot, is a pretty decent fairy tale in the literary tradition. It doesn't, for a second, feel like the kind of fairy tale you get when you're collecting fairy tales from an oral tradition, but it absolutely meets any standard that I would apply to a literary fairy tale, such as Hans Christian Andersen or Oscar Wilde wrote. After each fairy tale in the book, there is a commentary ostensibly written by Albus Dumbledore, which is a fun literary device. His commentary on The Hopping Pot is interesting. It talks about two different versions of the fairy tale that you might see if you lived in Wizarding Britain. The first version is a cleaned up version, sort of akin to what you might expect out of Disney or any other lame-ass modern children's book, which Dumbledore clearly does not approve of, which I in turn do approve of Dumbledore's lack of approval. Anyway, the second version is a pure-blood, anti-Muggle version of the tale that rings a little false to me as someone who's studied a lot of fairy tales and rewritten a lot of fairy tales. The anti-Muggle version of The Hopping Pot that J.K. Rowling has created for Dumbledore to talk to us about just doesn't feel right. It just doesn't feel like the natural progression of a story like that. I'm not sure how I would have written it differently, I just know that it felt like she was reaching. The second story in the collection is The Fountain of Fortune, and it's another solid literary fairy tale. Everything happens in threes, there's three witches and a forlorn knight, and that foursome is a very, I don't want to say standard, but certainly appropriate group of heroes to be following. They're certainly an appropriate band of heroes to be following through a fairy tale. And the whole thing ties up with a neat little bow at the end of the story with a moral about making your own happy endings. Which is a big part of why this feels literary and not like an oral story written down. You'll find as you're reading actual fairy tales, stories that came originally from the oral tradition, almost never have that kind of like clear stamp of a moral to be learned or taught. And when they do, it's usually because someone's taken an oral story and heavily edited it and editorialized it to smash that moral in there. The Dumbledore commentary on The Fountain of Fortune is kind of a letdown after the first commentary. The first commentary was sort of this really interesting, very tiny, but really interesting window into the history of Wizarding Britain, magical Britain. And the commentary on The Fountain of Fortune is this anecdote about when somebody tried to do it as a pageant for the Yule Ball or something like that. And it's fine as far as it goes, and I appreciate that J.K. Rowling not only had to come up with some stories that were fairy tales from the perspective of Wizarding Britain, of the magical world, but then also write commentary on those stories from the perspective of a fictional character she also created. That's a huge challenge, and so I don't mean to get down on her about this, but the truth is the commentary on this particular story was just not that interesting or enlightening. I didn't feel like I learned anything about the wizarding world through that commentary, and so that was sort of a disappointment. The third story in this collection is The Warlock with the Hairy Heart. And this is the one that I think felt the most real to me in terms of being a fairy tale that might have come from an oral tradition. It's gruesome, it's nasty, there's a moral, but you have to find it for yourself. It's not a clear-cut, in-your-face moral quite the same way that you got in The Fountain of Fortune. The major device used in The Warlock with the Hairy Heart is that his heart has been removed and he's hidden it away somewhere safe, which I'm sure there are others, but I know of at least one fairy tale, Norwegian fairy tale, called The Giant Who Had No Heart in His Body, something like that, in which a magical person of some sort has removed their heart, and in this case hidden it in a duck's egg, and depending on which version of the story you read or hear, that ends badly for him. Pretty much always, but sometimes less badly than others. Jim Henson did a version of it on the Storyteller series that he did back in the 80s? late 80s, early 90s. I could go check IMDb, but I'm not going to. But so yeah, so it was bloody and gruesome, and it just felt more like something that came straight out of a literary tradition. Dumbledore's commentary on this is unsurprisingly mostly about the importance of love, which is unsurprising when you consider that in the Harry Potter universe, love is this ancient magic that is what saves Harry in the first book. And if you didn't know that, seriously, why are you even watching this video? Like, what are you getting out of me talking about Beedle the Bard? I can't imagine. So he talks a lot about love and the importance of love and how deranged and misguided this warlock was for trying to avoid it. And of course he also talks a bit about Horcruxes, or, you know, lich phylacteries, if you're a big nerd like me. Point is, that parallel is definitely made. The penultimate story in this collection, there's only 5 stories in the whole book, is Babbity Rabbity and her Cackling Cauldron, and the Cackling Cauldron, I don't remember now. And I was really excited to read it, because aside from the tale of the 3 brothers, the 3 Peverell brothers, Babbity Rabbity is the only one that we really hear mentioned by name. The first time Beedle the Bard is mentioned at all in the series, Harry is of course clueless, and everyone's like, oh yeah, no, you know, Babbity Rabbity! And so I really just wanted this to be an excellent story. Like, the fact that Ron felt this was such a universal story that even Muggle-raised Harry must know it. I wanted the Wizarding World equivalent of Little Red Riding Hood. You know, I wanted that visceral, even if you can only tell the story in broad strokes, you've got a lot of strong imagery associated with it, you know the story. And I wanted Babbity Rabbity to hit me that way. And it doesn't. It's just, I mean, it's a fine story, but it's just not anything especially special. The commentary on Babbity Rabbity, again, sort of goes back to that window into the history of the magical world, and talks about the fact that this story, more than any of the others collected in Beedle the Bard, adheres to the rules of real-world magic as far as they are known to Dumbledore, with the only exception being that Babbity Rabbity retains the power of human speech while in her animagus form. And that's neat. It also talks a little bit about the fact that Babbity may have been based on this French witch who escaped execution by turning into a rabbit and crossing the English Channel. And that's a neat bit of information. The part that bothers me is that after Dumbledore talks about this witch that Babbity Rabbity may or may not have been based on, and talks about her crossing the English Channel, he then claims that Henry VI, who, given the date of escape he's provided for, or Rowling has provided for this witch's escape, matches up more or less. Henry VI had a white rabbit as one of his closest counselors, and comments that that might be part of why he was considered mad, and that possibly this witch was that white rabbit. And it's really interesting, and I went, huh, how cool. And I went and I looked it up, because, frankly, history is weird, and for all I knew, Henry VI had a pet rabbit that he insisted was intelligent and helped him, like, in war councils or whatever. Only he didn't. And that irritates me because it's such a small detail, and it would have been so much richer if that had had even just the tiniest grain of truth to connect to in the real world, right? Because that's something that is not going to get omitted from a Muggle history book. And so it destroys the illusion that the book is creating by saying, here are the stories and here's Dumbledore's commentary within the context of Wizarding Britain, of magical Britain, within the context of this world being real. Here are the stories, here's the commentary. Oh, here's a tidbit that directly relates to the Muggle world that is easily disproven. Destroys the illusion. And that's annoying. Alright, I'm not going to talk about the tale of the 3 brothers we all know the story, or if we're Harry Potter fans, we all know the story. And again, if you're not a Harry Potter fan, not that I don't appreciate the views and all, but I really do not understand what you're getting out of this video. So we all know the story of the three brothers. Dumbledore's commentary starts with the unsurprising fact that it was his favorite story as a child, that it always captured his imagination. And then this interesting tidbit that Aberforth's favorite fairy tale that he always wanted to hear at bedtime was Grumble the Grubby Goat. Which isn't in this book! I just feel like, why do that to me? Why? Is it a version of Billy Goat's Gruff, but from a wizarding perspective? Is it completely unrelated? Is it a cutesy name you felt like using and then couldn't write a story for, and so you threw it in here, and now I just have to spend the rest of forever wondering about the story of Grumble the Grubby Goat? I don't know what it is, because I don't have it! I'm better now. The commentary then goes on to talk about the Deathly Hallows, of course. And it's an interesting commentary, because if we're to assume that Dumbledore wrote the commentary with the intention of having it published in magical Britain, then it makes sense. But if we assume that it is in fact a commentary for his own personal notes, his own personal recollections, what have you, which is the only way to explain the commentary on The Fountain of Fortune, which was completely personal and had no academic reason to be in a book like this whatsoever. Yes, I know I'm insane. Nothing about this is academic. It's all fictional. I understand that. If these are notes for Dumbledore's own records, then the notes don't make sense. Because he spends pretty much the entire commentary section talking about how these items clearly don't actually exist. There's legends about them, but they're obviously false. He spends some time tracing the supposed line of ownership of the Elder Wand. Claims if there was ever a invisibility cloak and a Peveril brother that passed that on, that either the family doesn't know they have it or are keeping it secret. And basically just flat out denies that anything could possibly be the Resurrection Stone. Resurrection Stone is just nonsense in his book. The trouble with all of that is that we know Dumbledore owned and used the Elder Wand for years, prior to Harry even being born. If I recall correctly, he got it around the same time he defeated Grindelwald, right? So he's had this thing for fucking ever. He knows that the Potter family has the true Cloak of Invisibility. Or if he doesn't know, he certainly has the information to piece it together. And I don't know where the fuck the Resurrection Stone was this whole time, but we know somewhere, prior to the events of his death in Half-Blood Prince, he gets the Resurrection Stone and hides it in a snitch for Harry to find and use later. So I don't really understand these notes, but he's like, these things don't exist. You know that they do. You know that they do. And, JK, you know that the audience knows that he knows. So what the fuck is this commentary about? It's entirely possible that I'm a little too invested in this. I really did start off to, analyze these as fairy tales and talk about them as fairy tales, but then I got to the Peveril brothers and I got angry, because the commentary on that is stupid. And we all know that it's stupid. And I'm going to stop talking about it now. So that's it. That's my take on the tales of Beedle the Bard. If you have any questions about my opinions on the stories, or anything at all, really, please leave me a comment, send me an email, reach out to me on some other form of social media.